As I Lay Dying, William Faulkner's 1930 novel focuses on the consciousness and interiority of 15 different characters, all of them narrating from their own point of view, with each chapter marked simply by the individual narrator's name. Faulkner's story seems to be connected to the great changes in society and America in the early 20th century, especially those related to scientific ideas, the atom, time, and space. And each individual was forced to consider his place in a world that had been, in some ways, turned upside down by the Industrial Revolution, the ravages of World War I, and Einstein's theories, which had turned time into a psychological phenomenon. For anyone alive then, the vision of life and perception of reality had been fractured by events and discoveries. Considering the time in which Faulkner wrote, one would have to include and consider Freud's theories on consciousness itself, although in a Paris Review interview, Faulkner claimed to have never read Freud. This modern shift in perception and Faulkner's choice to build an entire novel through interior monologues, in reality to build it solely on the thoughts and memories of his characters, to build it on their minds, marks As I Lay Dying as a very distinct modern text, one that is most concerned with those questions regarding identity and perception, and perhaps tries to explain consciousness itself outside of the plot, which is fairly simple and straightforward. What is most important about the book is the idea that an individual can ponder larger philosophical and existential questions even if he or she cannot articulate them. It is the language that is most notable in As I Lay Dying, as Faulkner looks to be, at first glance, indecisive about the narrative voice. There is a direct conflict between the colloquialisms of the deep American South, the real spoken language of the Bundrans, and the more sophisticated language of educated, self-conscious characters who are curious and articulate in these disparate interior monologues and in their consideration of events around them. For some critics, this dichotomy is problematic. Can an author have it both ways? And are these characters capable and worthy of these carefully articulated thoughts? R.W. Franklin, for one, offered that Faulkner's word choices were a mistake. But Faulkner certainly had an eye on the idea that time and perception and ideas on consciousness had all been profoundly changed. And this fracture led to deep interior conflicts for individuals relative to belief systems and the personal ethos that one might carry through life. What happens to a person who has lived and sustained themselves in a rural setting, for example, when a more urban and capitalist society begins to encroach on the very means of sustenance? And how does one grapple with the idea that swift changes in society might topple the very same ethos he has relied upon, when secular ideas begin to overtake the religious beliefs that have guided him? When one begins to consider this, it raises the possibility that Faulkner's choice to present a mixture of language was a purposeful one. Faulkner is said to have drafted As I Lay Dying in 6 weeks while he was working night shift at the University of Mississippi power plant in 1929. He had already written 2 novels, encouraged by Sherwood Anderson. But the swift manner in which As I Lay Dying was written leads one to wonder whether Franklin was correct. Is the language simply a mistake? Was Faulkner sloppy because he wrote so quickly? For its time, the novel was unconventional, to say the least, and the mixture of language might make one wonder at what the book is meant to be, since interior monologues, especially in terms of the realism that came before it, normally look very similar to actual dialogue. That is, a character's thoughts presented by an author or narrator would not go beyond his normal capacity for language. We might begin with Faulkner's vision of the world. One can hardly imagine the profound changes in the American South in the years after the Civil War, or that the author was blind to them. An entire culture had to be transformed, and there would be a dynamic relation between modernization and modernism, especially in the years after World War I. Art and literature changed as rapidly as social and cultural norms, kept up with them, possibly predicted them, and reflected them in a search for meaning. As the editors of the Norton Anthology note, the modernists worked on the premise that previously sustaining structures of human life, whether social, political, religious, or artistic, had been destroyed or shown up as falsehoods, or at best arbitrary and fragile human constructions. Reality, as it had been perceived or conceived, was no longer reliable. Artists and writers would have to speak to this new human condition, or more accurately, speak from it. Faulkner was born, raised, and educated in the American South, but his family was well-to-do. He was mentored by friends and family members, and his worldview would not be formed in a bubble. He attended school at the University of Mississippi, though he dropped out in 1920. But Faulkner was exposed to ideas, which goes directly to his recognition of a fractured vision of reality, multiple and subjective perspectives on any given situation, and the profound effect this fracturing would have on belief. Faulkner was very much aware of these changes, aware of movement within art and literature, certainly aware of Cubism and Picasso, aware of Einstein's theories. Upon close examination, As I Lay Dying is every bit as abstract as one of Picasso's paintings. The aesthetic of literary modernism appears in the fragmented narrative, relativism generated by contradictory points of view, and a focus on psychology rather than event. How does Faulkner's structure relate to Picasso and Cubism, and are the aesthetic concerns of these disparate artists more similar than we might realize? Gelman says that Faulkner saw modernist paintings on a trip to Paris in 1925, his first visit to the European continent. He wrote enthusiastically about what he had seen in a letter to his family. "I have seen Rodin's museum and 2 private collections of Matisse and Picasso." In the same letter, Faulkner noted that Matisse and Picasso were still alive, still painting. The cubism of Picasso stayed with him, it would seem. And it must be clarified here that Picasso's analytic cubism simultaneously presented subjects from multiple perspectives. Is it possible that Faulkner used that method in his early books in a purposeful way? Some critics say yes, that this was a deliberate choice, and Faulkner wrote his first novels after this trip to Europe. Apparently, Faulkner never spoke about whether or how Cubism influenced his fiction, but it is not difficult to conclude that it did. What is necessary in considering the form of As I Lay Dying is the idea that mass, location, space, and time could no longer be received as the absolutes they had once seemed to be. Abstract artists responded to this change in perception, even if they did it in different ways. Science had removed order from the universe. There was only disorder and incessant change that swept stability away from our perception of reality. Cubism, in particular, must have been attractive to Faulkner because it offered the freedom to present novel views of the world. This idea would be important to any modernist writer, and it is profoundly interesting relative to Faulkner on 2 levels. First, the idea of presenting a single event from multiple perspectives, as Picasso did, and second, the move inward to explore the subconscious, which might be viewed as more permanent than outward reality. Modern art, like modernist literature, is very difficult to delineate on a timeline, and it is almost impossible to say when it emerged. But Picasso and Georges Braque, especially between 1909 and 1911, made the issue of figuration versus abstraction a conscious matter. And an astute reader might conclude that Faulkner considered these ideas as a conscious matter as well. For a writer to depend only on the workings of his characters' minds certainly embodies this battle. After he had seen Picasso's work in person, Faulkner might have made a conscious decision on his methods for presenting a narrative built from the abstractions of the mind. Faulkner's method, at least on the surface, can be called interiority, or free indirect discourse, if we need to put a name to it. Perhaps, though, in light of Hale's assertion that free indirect discourse usually mirrors dialogue in its language, This is an oversimplification. Free indirect discourse is a literary device that allows the author to expose a character's thoughts without dialogue. However, the language is inconsistent in As I Lay Dying, and this might be recognized by even the most casual reader. The narrative, supposedly driven by poor, uneducated Southern whites, is remarkable for monologues that move out of the rural vernacular from the first page. The diction is actually a confusion of two vernaculars. Interior monologue's realism lies in its ability to seem wholly unmediated. No narrator intervenes between the reader and the characters, and the reader sees unfiltered thought. But the conflict in language arises immediately in As I Lay Dying, where Darrell opens the book by saying, "Jewel and I come up from the field." And one wonders how much of this speech belongs to Darrell and how much belongs to the author. The incorrect tense of come rings true, and yet one might question whether Darrell would say me rather than I, since I is grammatically correct. On the same page, Darrell describes the path as worn so by feet in fading precision. Would Darrell speak of fading precision? It hardly seems likely. Faulkner's word choices matter, and the language might be viewed as a modernist tool, one that shows the significant difference between an individual's private and public life. Darrell might not speak in this way, but he can certainly think in those terms. Moreover, Faulkner was not interested in realism. In As I Lay Dying, we see the individual not as he might appear to others, not as he acts and speaks, but as he really is. Faulkner is interested in the complexity of the individual, the infinite possibilities of the mind, interested in something other than the public manifestation of that person. The point seems to be that one does not need money or education to ponder deeper philosophical questions of identity. We all consider larger existential questions, even when we are unable to articulate them, unable to thoroughly define or speak coherently about those questions. Faulkner stepped beyond spoken language and into the incongruous workings of the mind to portray the depth of these thoughts. But readers normally have assumptions about what we see on the page. We can assume that dialogue within a work of fiction is always representational of the reality that a work of fiction is trying to portray. For example, an untrustworthy narrator would still be a faithful recorder of other characters' speech. In a conventional novel, even as the author or narrator portrays thoughts and feelings, as readers, we suppose that dialogue is the most faithful representation of that reality, not a judgment from the narrator, and that the words inside quotation marks are accurate, that they are, in fact, real. But why would the mere placement of quotation marks by an author make any description or recollection more real? We must consider this representation as the author imagined it and question the reliability of the narrator. In the context of As I Lay Dying, it is perhaps impossible to answer questions about reliability and reality, since all of the talking takes place in an obviously fictional world that, in the first place, had to be imagined by Faulkner. All of it is presented by characters who have stepped outside of dialogue. These interior monologues go directly to the perceptions of each character and to how the author imagined them. There is dialogue, there are quotation marks, a purposeful choice by Faulkner, but in the world of the Bundrans, these are individual memories and nothing more. Much like real life, 5 people in a room will have 5 different perceptions of what happened, of what people are doing, of what people are thinking, of what they heard, and we must consider this. These individual narrators are not talking to one another. They are speaking directly to the reader, or more specifically, they are thinking and remembering for the reader. Do we trust their perception, their reality, their memory of what was said or done? In 1957, Faulkner spoke at length about the conflicts that men face and made it clear that these conflicts were of primary interest to him. Man in conflict with himself, with his fellow man, and with his time and place, his environment. This is an interesting concept since each of us has a particular ethos that we bring to each situation. Preconceptions, biases, values, and beliefs that can sometimes shade our vision and force us to question our own reactions, especially in hindsight. Faulkner seems to focus on this in the novel, where belief systems and perception are set against hard realities. The belief systems and perceptions are far more important than the events. Beginning on page 166, Cora talks at great length about the disparity in how she and Addie view God and sin. Cora shows humility and at the same time a sort of seething judgment as she considers Addie. This speaks to Faulkner's choice to tell a story through disparate narrators so that each voice tries to define reality and the reader is left to surmise that reality is a subjective experience and that there cannot or will not be a single definition of that reality. This conflict creates drama in the novel. Perhaps reality cannot be defined, and that affected Faulkner's writing. Reality is in our minds then, created by our consciousness. And the way that consciousness has been shaped by hereditary factors and environment. This complexity was vitally important to Faulkner. In 1925, Faulkner said that mankind lives in a world of illusion. Much of what Faulkner meant was related to finding meaning in a chaotic existence and fighting the forces that we might call fate, where we might not trust reality as being real. Reality is far too subjective for that. It is an illusion. Ergo contends that Faulkner's characters search for meaning through these interior dramas. Interior dramas revolve around beliefs and anxieties, especially as they are placed against the realities of the past. We are all products of the time in which we live. We are, many times, told what to believe, and yet we still strive to form an independent view, independent of what we are told or given. Understanding is created and projected by the mind. While there is ostensibly a single purpose for the Bundren's trip to Jefferson, there are underlying actions where the individual aims are different, and thus the focus is different for each character. Ants will buy new teeth. Dewey Dell seeks an abortion. Vardaman hopes to see the toy train, and Cash brings his toolbox so he can work on Tull's barn. All of this seems simple enough, but personal motivation looms large in our perceptions. And changing that perception, chapter by chapter, is a profound way for Faulkner to get to individuality and consciousness. Likewise, each character copes with things in a different way. Ants has a passive, consumer-oriented mastery of life. He simply replaces a used-up wife with a new one, and Cash is the practical one, constructing the coffin, a new place for Addie's body. Cash's list on pages 82 and 83 is stunning in its own way. He lists reasons for building the coffin on the bevel, and all is practical, simply based on things observed, how things work. It is Cash's reality, and meaning is not as important to him, and neither is purpose, though he does try to create order. He writes, Faulkner writes, "You can see by an old grave that the earth sinks down on the bevel." This observation tells Cash what to do. Faulkner's work rejects the forms that came before, rejects any form of realism. If Faulkner, along with Picasso, was going to reject realism, he would supply a furtive reference through one of his narrators in As I Lay Dying, and in one sentence the reader might surmise that the conflicted language, the colloquial versus the more educated and philosophical vernacular, is indeed a purposeful choice. Faulkner seems to wear his influences directly on his sleeve, as Darrell describes his mother's coffin in the Gillespie barn, which is now a fire. The front, the conical facade with the square orifice of the doorway, broken only by the square, squat shape of the coffin on the sawhorses, like a cubistic bug, comes into relief. Even in the chaos of the fire, Darrell finds geometric shapes, finds cubism, which seem to offer him a type of order. Faulkner might be saying if a poor white boy from the American South could only be exposed to Picasso and modern art, he would certainly understand the intention behind it. And that seems to be the larger point of the entire novel. Certainly we understand that Faulkner has absorbed Picasso's aims. We might conclude that Darl is speaking directly to the modernist aesthetic, then speaking to Picasso, thanking him perhaps, and announcing the novel as Faulkner's attempt at literary cubism. Matthews calls this the exorcism of realism. It is loudly announced here, but it is also apparent throughout the book in Faulkner's abstract form, in the stream of conscious narrative, and in the complexity of the language, the very mixture of differing vernaculars, which speaks to the overwhelming problem of becoming a thinking, conscious being. Faulkner achieves this by flipping the convention for representing a character's interior life on its head. He will not adhere to a strict definition of language existing simply to be spoken. Language, for all of us, is more complicated than that. Faulkner's first novel, Soldier's Pay, hints at this idea and makes it apparent that this discrepancy between private and public life, between language and perception, was already on Faulkner's mind in 1926, just a year after he visited France. Soldier's Pay insists on the difference between what his characters think and what they say. In that first novel, Faulkner was concerned about language on three levels: the words used for verbal communication, thoughts that might be articulated as dialogue but are kept private, and those things that might be unsayable. The result of these three modes of communication is to give agency of higher thought to each character, each individual. The Bundrans possess the same mental capabilities and tendencies toward the philosophical as characters who might be outwardly more intelligent or at least more educated. In realizing this, we find that Faulkner's language, which at first might be seen as inconsistent, is, in fact, perhaps more accurate than any language conveyed in a more realistic text. It is even possible to conclude that Faulkner plays with the relativity of time and space, as different narrators denote time in different ways. We might see that at the very beginning of As I Lay Dying, when Darl says in the first sentence, "Jewel and I come up from the field." The tense confusion in the verb is a common attribute of rural language, and yet the first chapter of the book is entirely in the present tense. Likewise, when Vardaman narrates, he avoids the past tense of I said. Instead, he uses I say, and Darl says. Faulkner uses this tool, if we can call it that, throughout the book, perhaps to distort the reader's sense of time, perhaps to note, in a surreptitious way, that time is, after all, relative, purely subjective in how it passes, and most certainly a psychological tool for all of humanity. Each of Faulkner's characters will perceive time in a different way, and the reader can never be certain about time. As readers, we look for order, we look for a plot, we pay attention to action and dialogue so that a story makes sense and possibly enriches us somehow. On the surface, Faulkner's work can be a simple slice of life. The Bundrans await Addie's death. They prepare for and plan her burial. They deal with the mundane facts of daily life as they undertake their journey. Each character has problems that exist outside of Addie's passing, and those individual problems are subtext to the main thrust of the story. We want the plot to be simple and clear, and we want resolution in the story. But it seems apparent that Faulkner had larger themes on his mind as he composed As I Lay Dying, and the simple plot becomes larger and more complicated when we view it through a different lens. Faulkner never intended to produce a realistic novel, never thought of free indirect discourse as a route toward realism. Instead, he was interested in constantly breaking the novel's perceptual surface. If Picasso worked to shatter representational images as being too simplistic, William Faulkner's aim was similar. And if we choose to look at As I Lay Dying through the deconstructionist philosophy of Derrida, for example, we might recognize the language as a triumph rather than a mistake. Faulkner's visit to France, his consideration of modern art, and his efforts at utilizing the dichotomy between spoken language and unarticulated thought in his earliest work, all of these things point to a purposeful deconstruction of realism, a calculated move toward a more modern take on a fairly simple storyline. Faulkner's text is a modernist tour de force, as he called it, precisely because he subverts the concept of self that it is supposed to represent, precisely because he moves between past and present tense throughout the novel and skews our sense of time. When we consider the time in which Faulkner wrote, the swift changes in society and culture, we can hardly question why he made this effort, and we must conclude that there was no mistake in the composition of As I Lay Dying. This purposeful portrayal of consciousness and the subjective nature of reality is perhaps a more accurate look at human perception than any text that falls under the umbrella of realism. To paraphrase Linton, an unwavering look at the subconscious mind might be more permanent than anything that happens outwardly. That point is underscored by the fact that Faulkner is still very relevant today.